$84 trillion is set to change hands over the next 20 years. Whether you're passing it down or inheriting it, the decisions you make today will shape your family's financial future for generations. Welcome to the Great Wealth Transfer, where David Pulcini, CFP, guides you through the strategies, insights, and pitfalls of navigating one of the largest financial shifts in history. What you don't know could redefine your legacy.
Let me ask you something. When you leave money to your children, are you also leaving it to their spouses? Now, maybe your first instinct is to say no, but the reality is if you don't have the right structure in place, you might be handing over part of your life's work to an ex-son-in-law or a future ex-daughter-in-law without even knowing it, or any combination of that, right? And let me be clear, this isn't about being cold or controlling. This is about protecting your own legacy, your intentions, and the people that you care about the most, okay? So in today's episode, we're digging into what happens when wealth transfer gets complicated by marriages, divorces, family dynamics, and all the things that don't always go the way that we hoped, and many of us know that. Because the truth is, and let's face it, most people don't plan to leave their wealth to their in-laws. But if you don't do anything, that might happen anyway. So let me start with the basics here. A lot of families assume that just because an inheritance is intended for their child, it will always stay with that child. But here's what really happens. If your son or daughter receives a large inheritance and then mixes that money with joint accounts or uses it, for example, to pay off a mortgage on a home that they own with their spouse, it can become marital property. And if that marriage ever ends, half of that wealth could walk right out the door. And this actually happens all the time. And sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's obviously very dramatic, but it almost always happens when no one talks about it ahead of time, or maybe the folks just don't know what they don't know. So they don't even know to talk about it. And that's why we're doing this episode. So do we have time for some real examples? We're going to do some real examples. I want to give you some things to think about if you've not already, okay? And I want to give 4 or 5 examples of what I've seen just personally. I'm one advisor, and I've seen these things in the last 12 months. And the first one, let's name it the commingled business disaster. Your child uses a big part of their inheritance to start a business, but they list their spouse as a 50% partner because we're in this together, right? The marriage falls apart 3 years later. The business is now thriving, but in the divorce, the spouse walks away with half of the business equity and half of the family wealth permanently. So the lesson here is, first of all, let's keep the capital separate, that inherited money. Let's keep it separate. I would consider certain ownership clauses in a business or protective trusts for business ventures, okay? And I know that's very specific, but again, I just saw this happen. Another one, surprise beneficiary. I've talked about this before. You forgot to update an old life insurance policy or a retirement account, and the listed beneficiary could be a child's ex-spouse. This does happen, okay? After your death, the company pays them directly, not your child, not your grandkids, and not your estate. And guess what? Legally, there's almost nothing you can do about it, okay? So our lesson here is review your beneficiary designations regularly, especially after marriages, divorces, or any other major life events that come along, okay? Let's do a third example here. I'll call this one the lifetime alimony fund. So you gift your daughter and her husband a large sum as a wedding gift. Let's say it's $250,000 to help them buy a house. And the house is titled jointly. You can see where this is headed. They divorce 10 years later, and that gift is now considered part of the marital estate. The ex-husband walks away with half of the equity funded by your generosity. So if you're gifting for a home, consider a promissory note or a separate deed structure, or titling the home just in your child's name. The spouse should understand that, the in-law, right? Let's do number 4 here. I've seen this many times, and I've seen it. It hasn't played out, but I'm trying to warn the right folks, and I want to call this the custody conundrum. You want to leave money for your minor grandchildren so that you can create a custodial account or leave assets outright in your will. Here's the catch. Your daughter is divorced, and her ex-husband, the one that you didn't really like anyway, but now you definitely don't trust, has 50-50 custody of your grandkids. When you pass, he may gain control over the funds as a surviving legal guardian. Okay? He now has influence over how and when that money is used, and it may not reflect your values or intentions, and it probably won't. So whether it's private school tuition, summer camps, managing the investments, you are no longer the gatekeeper, and neither is your daughter. So the lesson here, use a trust instead of a simple custodial account or direct gift. We would appoint an independent trustee to oversee how and when the funds are distributed for the grandkids' benefit and protecting that money from the wrong hands, okay? You earned it. Why are we handing it over to somebody else? And let's do number 5 here. We'll call it the step family switcheroo. So this actually just happened in a famous case. You remarry later in life and leave your estate to your spouse and then to your children. That sounds fair, right? A lot of people do this. Spouse, then my children. But when you pass, your new spouse changes the will, remarries, or rewrites the trust, leaving everything to their children or their new partner. Your children end up with nothing. The wealth is permanently redirected out of the bloodline. So we would use an irrevocable trust and clear estate language to ensure that your children are protected after you're gone, even if your spouse remarries or changes their mind, right? So hopefully these examples have you thinking. I could keep going, but we'll stop there. So what can we do about this? What are the tools and strategies that real families use to handle this? I want to talk through 3 of the most common approaches. And number 1 is just an inheritance trust. You can leave your child's inheritance inside of a trust that is specifically designed to keep assets separate from their spouse. These are often referred to as bloodline trusts because they're built to ensure that the wealth stays within your bloodline. So the child can still benefit from it. They can use the money for a house, for education, for investing, but it remains protected from the divorce, the lawsuits, or even bad financial decisions on their part, right? Number 2, prenups and postnups. We know what prenups are. A lot of people talk about it. We don't talk about postnups a lot, but and yes, they can be a little awkward, but in wealthy families, they are also increasingly normal. So a prenup or prenuptial agreement signed before marriage or a postnuptial is just signed after marriage can help clearly define what belongs to whom. And if your child is going to receive significant assets, these agreements can keep things, we'll call it clean and fair, okay? Number 3, conditional giving. Another route here is to structure gifts based on specific milestones. We've talked about this before. You want to help your child buy a house? Awesome, great. But make sure the ownership is in their name only. You want to support a new business? Awesome, excellent. Just keep the equity separate. We talked about that, okay? Now, I know you might be thinking, won't this hurt somebody's feelings? Won't this send a message that I don't trust my son-in-law or daughter-in-law? Possibly, but here's the thing. It's not about trust. It's about responsibility. We'll call it boundaries. I always say this. You can love someone and still put structures in place that protect your family. And frankly, if your child's spouse has a problem with these protections or boundaries, that probably says something too, right? Because let's be honest, most reasonable, respectful spouses understand that legacy planning is just that. It's planning. It's not a personal attack. So let's do a real life hypothetical here, and we'll call it the parents who didn't trust the son-in-law. And I want to walk you through a scenario that I see in different forms, again, at least once or twice a year. And we will name these folks Alan and Linda, okay? They're in their late 70s. They have a net worth around $12 million and 2 adult children. Their daughter, Kelly, is married to a man named Bryce. Now, Alan and Linda have always had, I'm going to say this nicely, we're going to say reservations about Bryce, okay? He's not a bad person, but he's bounced from job to job. He's made some risky investments that didn't pan out, and they've noticed some tension around money whenever the four of them are together. And Alan once told me if we gave them $1 million, Bryce would be on a golf trip the next day. Okay, so here's the dilemma. They want to help Kelly. They want to set her up for a secure future, but they don't want to fund Bryce's next, we'll call it half-baked business idea, or leave money vulnerable in the event of a divorce. So we structured a plan. Instead of a direct inheritance, a trust was set up, a discretionary trust for Kelly. She has access to the funds for specific purposes: education, home purchase, medical needs, investing. The trust is managed by a third-party trustee, not Kelly, not Alan, not Linda. That way, no one can accuse them of holding onto the purse strings, right? So we had an open and respectful conversation with Kelly about why this was set up the way it was. And you know what? Kelly was actually relieved. She admitted that sometimes she feels pressure from Bryce when it comes to money, and this gave her a sense of security and independence. And obviously that's a win. And Bryce, honestly, well, now he just has to deal with it, okay? So let's flip it. There's also plenty of situations where the in-law is the most responsible person in the entire family, okay? I'm not going to say that I'm a responsible in-law, but maybe I am. But what if your daughter marries someone who runs the household finances, volunteers in the community? They've treated your family with respect for decades, right? Should they be included in your estate plan? That's up to you, maybe, and there are ways to do that. You could name them in a separate bequest. So you could create a shared trust for your child and their spouse with safeguards. You could even take out a life insurance policy earmarked just for that in-law. So the key here is just be intentional. It's intentionality. Don't let it happen by default. We want to choose where this goes, okay? I want to close with this. Many families don't talk about this because honestly, they just don't want to. There's not a great environment for this conversation to happen. And so an action item here is to have your financial advisor or attorney invite the right people in to talk about the structure and how it will help everyone in the family to follow the plan. Most families, though, just avoid this conversation out of fear. And it's the fear of hurting feelings, the fear of sounding controlling, the fear of creating division. But you know what creates real division, right? It's silence, okay? We see more things happen afterward if it's not talked about than if we just talked about it up front. So if you want your legacy to last, you have to talk about it. You have to explain the why behind your plan, and you have to give your kids the confidence that you're acting out of love, not just judgment, okay? You're not trying to control their lives. You're trying to protect the life that you built and make sure it serves them well for decades, okay? That's it for today. If this episode struck a chord with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, wealth isn't just represented by dollars and cents. It represents the values, the sacrifice, intention, and love. In our next episode, we're going to dive into how blended families can navigate an inheritance. A lot of interesting things with that. And legacy without creating resentment or confusion. Make it a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Great Wealth Transfer Podcast. If this podcast resonates with you, reach out to 6 Point Financial Partners at 585-485-6048 or email dpulcini@6pointfp.com.
Content here is for illustrative purposes and general information only. It is not legal, tax, or individualized financial advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any specific security or engage in any specific trading strategy. All investing involves risk, including loss of principal. Results will vary. Past performance is no indication of future results or success. Market conditions change continuously. Information here is provided in part by third-party sources. These sources are generally deemed to be reliable. However, neither 6 Point Financial Partners, Private Client Services, nor RFG Advisory guarantee the accuracy of third-party sources. The views expressed here are those of 6 Point Financial Partners. They do not necessarily represent those of Private Client Services, RFG Advisory, their employees, or their clients. This commentary should not be regarded as a description of advisory services provided by 6 Point Financial Partners or RFG Advisory, or performance returns of any client. The views reflected in the commentary are subject to change at any time without notice. Securities offered by registered representatives through Private Client Services. Member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered by investment advisory representatives of RFG Advisory LLC, RFG Advisory, or RFG. A registered investment advisor. Private Client Services, 6 Point Financial Partners, and RFG Advisory Advisory are unaffiliated entities. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where RFG Advisory and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advisory services may be rendered by RFG Advisory unless a client agreement is in place.